Thanks, Marissa. Kia ora koutou, ko lu aho. This is the second of this three-part series. So the first one we had just a bit of an overview of this topic. So if you haven't heard that one and you want a little bit more context, you can go back and look at that recording. But today we are exploring ways to optimize workplaces for neurodiversity. So to introduce myself, ko lu aho. Nor ngā motu aho. I'm a health coach. I'm based in Ngā Motu, New Plymouth, and my focus is on working with neurodivergent adults. So mostly people who might identify as autistic or ADHD, maybe as being gifted or highly sensitive, whatever that looks like for them. Some people are formally diagnosed, some aren't. And that coaching support might look like managing stress or burnout, navigating tricky situations at work, and finding strategies that actually fit how their brains work. And a lot of this work involves people wanting to do their jobs well. So together we might find some ways forward that they want to put into action, and then they might need to have a conversation with their manager at work about what they need to be able to do that. And that's really where the session today comes in, because that self-understanding and having good strategies can only take people so far. And then if the environment isn't flexible enough to allow for different ways of working, it's unlikely that somebody's going to be able to do their best. So we want to look at that collaboration between the individual and the people and systems and workplace around them. So today we're just looking at what that looks like from a leadership perspective. So I want to give you this question to sit with just as we get started, and we'll come back to this idea throughout this session. Are you a workplace where someone could say, I want to do this role really well, and this is what I need to be able to do that? Is that a discussion that you would be able to have with somebody on your team? So I just leave you to sit with that for a moment. But, oh, sorry, I've got the wrong slide here. But within our workplaces, like within all humanity, every team is neurodiverse. There is huge natural variation in how we think, how we focus, how we communicate, how we work, and what we might be motivated by. But most environments, most workplaces are set up around assumptions about what suits most people. So that might be evidence-based, that might be what's considered best practice, but is that the best practice for the particular people who you have on your team? So some people in an environment that doesn't sort of suit them ideally might be able to cope for a while, might be able to get by okay. Other people might not be able to get by at all, or might not be able to work well in that environment. But even that coping has a long-term cost to it that might be invisible from the outside. And that's often where down the track we see burnout. We might see a high level of turnover and not really understand why. What we would like to see, and what I assume you'd like to see, is people thriving and being able to do their best work. So sustainable performance really does require a good fit between a person's needs and the environment they're in, not just pushing through. So I want to talk just briefly about disclosure. And what I mean here is when somebody comes to you, or maybe just brings it up in conversation and says, I'm autistic, I have ADHD, I have dyslexia or dyscalculia, or it might be even what we think of as like a chronic mental health diagnosis. I have depression, bipolar disorder. And where as a leader, you might be going, well, what do I do with this? So in talking about this, we need to acknowledge that not everybody who experiences these kinds of differences has a diagnosis. Not everybody would even use that language to describe themselves or think of themselves that way, even if that might correspond with how their mind probably works. And then within people who do identify as neurodivergent, very few of them will use that language or disclose to a manager for lots of reasons. And even if that's really helpful understanding for themselves, knowing that, when we're sharing with somebody else, if they don't understand what that means or they have prior assumptions that aren't helpful, then sometimes it's better to talk specifically about what we need than to use that language. It's also worth remembering that disclosure doesn't give you a list of needs. Somebody could say that they're autistic, and that could mean lots of different things about what they need in the workplace. Two people with the same diagnosis can need very different things. So rather than that giving you a roadmap about what it is that they're asking for or how to approach things, disclosure just opens up a conversation. So in New Zealand, yes, disclosed conditions that are identified as neurodevelopmental differences like autism and ADHD fall under the Human Rights Act. So reasonable accommodations are the legal requirement, but that's not where we want to be aiming for here, knowing that not everybody is disclosing. Instead, we want to be starting from a different kind of baseline that acknowledges that everybody is different and that everybody might have different needs. And that you don't have to be the expert in anything that people might be disclosing. You just need to be open to having those conversations with the person in front of you. So you can't rely on disclosure to know who might benefit from flexibility and different ways of doing things. And if we're not relying on that, then, sorry, just got a little bit lost here. Then rather than waiting for that disclosure, inclusive practices are going to support everybody to do better. So I do want to just give you this question to mull over for a moment. What beliefs do you hold about diagnosis, and how might those beliefs affect your team? So thinking about that, you might feel really good about the ways that the perspectives that you have there. It might be something to just kind of consider a little bit more. So when we talk about neurodivergence, we talk a lot about having spiky profiles. So what we mean by that isn't that you're a little bit of a spiky person in personality, but more that very few people are excellent at everything. And that's particularly often true for people who identify with neurodivergence, having real peaks and troughs in abilities. So again, this is true of most of us. We might be well-rounded in some ways, but there might be some things that we really excel at and other things that we find difficult. And I think this is, particularly worth noting when people have a neurodevelopmental difference like dyslexia or dyscalculia. If they are excellent at aspects of the job that involve, interacting with people or whatever that might look like, but really struggle with anything written, then does this job actually require those writing skills, or are there other ways that we can do things? If numbers just don't stick for them, And there's one aspect that involves needing to tally things up and count things up. Are there other ways that those tasks can be done while still being able to do the things that they're really good at well? So sometimes with this spiky profiles, with these strengths and challenges, we can end up really focused on the things that somebody is struggling with and perhaps lose sight of the things that they're great at. So this is where I want to encourage you with any role to just think a little bit about what is it in this role that truly needs excellence and what can be good enough and what can be done differently or supported. If it becomes you can only contribute this, the things that you do really well, if you can also do that, the things that you really find difficult, then that can mean that real capabilities are just left on the table and you end up missing out on the skills that some people bring. I want to give an example of different ways of thinking and how they can come with different strengths and different challenges. I wonder if anybody has heard of the difference between top-down thinking and bottom-up thinking. So top-down thinking seems to be like a more common way that a lot of people would naturally approach thinking and problem solving and the ways that their minds work, which starts with you have a situation, get some general understanding of it, you fill in the gaps with what you already know or what you might have done in past that's similar, and only needing to fill in the gaps or get more detail if it's necessary. So that might look like, you give somebody a task to do and they think, okay, I've done something similar before. So they go ahead and get started and do it in the same kind of way as they might have done something similar another time. Whereas people who tend more towards bottom-up thinking usually start on the collecting all of the details and the information before they then sort of make the connections, work it out, make sense, figure out what's the best way to go about it, and then they're able to act on that. So in another situation, in that sort of situation, you might ask somebody to do a task and they go, well, that's only a tiny bit of the information. What is it for? When does it need to be done by? Do you have an expectation about how this is done? Or can I just go for it? Wanting to get all of that context so they can figure out what's expected of them and how to do it best and then act on it. So people whose natural tendency is more towards bottom-up thinking, they often end up coming up with new ways to do things. It might mean a lot of creative problem solving. Those questions of why does it need to be done this way can be really helpful for kind of challenging systems that might not be particularly efficient. And this can often take more time. I think leaders often see that that their top-down thinkers might be able to get things done much more quickly and efficiently, and that might feel smooth and easy to work with. And perhaps you might find it frustrating when people keep on asking the why and you feel like they're challenging the way things are done. But understanding that people can't necessarily change whether they tend more towards top-down thinking or bottom-up thinking. But there is so much to be gained by understanding that some people are more this way, and then you're going to get those the problem solving that comes with that, the different approaches, and compared to your top-down thinkers. So there is not one ideal, there is not one best way, but our teams do best when we have both kinds of minds, both ways of thinking, and when they're working together. So I hope that makes some sense to you. So the frame for looking at things from here is really that the strengths that people in our teams have go together with the needs that they have. No, we don't get people's strengths unless their needs are also met. So this is where self-understanding and coaching comes in. They're both looking at what you're good at, what you do really well, and then also that question of what do I need to be able to do that? And those conversations need to go together. So as leaders, we need to get curious about both of these. And that's when the really useful stuff happens. So next, we're just going to look at a whole lot of examples of real differences that might come up in our workplaces. You can see that across our teams, whether people are really struggling or it might seem like they are doing fine and able to manage, that we still have different ways of doing things that might suit us better. And that if we're able to make space for those differences and allow for different ways of doing things and acknowledge them as just that, not right or wrong ways, then everybody is going to be able to do better. There's some examples here. So I don't know if you are people who prefer to have some music playing or things going on in the background to be able to focus on your work, or if you like to have an environment that is completely quiet, or anything in between. Again, for some people, this might just be a preference. For some people, this makes a real difference to how well we're able to work. So, how do we allow for those differences? If we are working in a shared environment, what does that look like? Does that mean that some people are able to wear headphones while they're working? Does that mean that we have dividers between desks so that people aren't distracted by others walking around, and moving around them? No, and for some people, the being around other people is really helpful. So conversations to have and to see what they might mean in your environment. And notice that some of these, they might be opposites. It's not just one person needing a particular accommodation, but differences that come up. So, some people being able to do their work uninterrupted and on their own is really important to their focus and their flow. So, perhaps having times when they're available to answer questions or to check their emails, and having times when they know that that's not going to be interrupted. Other people love having someone to bounce ideas off, to discuss things with, or even might be really motivated by knowing that there's somebody else who's working hard next to them, that keeps them on task. So again, conversations to have. For some people, being able to move or fidget makes a huge difference, and it's not just restlessness, but does help them to regulate and focus. For the person next to them, having somebody fidgeting might be a huge distraction. So how do we manage this and acknowledge both of those needs? So the point here isn't about sort of demanding that every possible preference is met, but it's more about assuming that there's no one right setup and acknowledging those needs and then problem solving together. And a lot of us, if we're in an environment that is a bit of a stressor, maybe doesn't suit us ideally, if we know that that has been acknowledged and understood, if we know that there are ways to escape from that when we need to, then we can often cope for a limited period of time if it's meaningful and for a reason. So it makes a huge difference to know that that is being seen and taken seriously. Looking at some that relate to communication and structure, and remembering I haven't divided these up into, what somebody's neurodivergent identity might be, because that can vary so much. And I wonder if there's things here that are relatable to all of us. So looking much more broadly at the sort of things that might come up. The ways that people like to receive feedback. And I think communication differences are a big thing to be aware of. And this is where even just thinking of it in terms of like cultural differences. If you are working with somebody who's from a culture where people are much more direct, then you might acknowledge that, okay, the way that they're saying something might not mean what perhaps if somebody in my family spoke to me that way, or the people who I'm kind of used to communicating like I do. And perhaps that might seem rude to me or seem a bit abrasive, but that doesn't mean that that's their intention, and there actually isn't a right way or a wrong way. So the same can be true across different neurotypes, that we can have different ways of communicating that might come a lot more easily and naturally to us, and that doesn't have to have a judgment to it, but just understanding that can make a huge difference. So that can be true of feedback too, that sometimes it can be really confusing to be given that sort of compliment sandwich feedback, or anxiety provoking for people who find sort of clear and direct much easier to understand what's going on. So when somebody comes in and tells you how well you've been doing at a job, and then they say, but certainly for me, that goes, oh wait, did you not mean the first bit? What's going on? Whereas raising the thing that is an issue, and then also remembering at other times to say the encouraging things make a huge difference. Some people, it is hugely helpful to frame those things together. So getting to know the people on your team and what they find most helpful. Looking at whether having things in writing or being given it verbally works better for people. I've been part of teams where if there's been an update in, say, organization-wide newsletter that has some things that are relevant to us, some things that aren't, some of us find it really hard to open up that newsletter, scan through it, figure out if anything there is something that we need to know or need to be aware of, when the inbox is also full of a whole lot of other things that are more pressing. And having those just noted in person in our regular meetings made a huge difference. Whereas for others, perhaps you don't hear things when they're said in person, or forget them, and having a follow-up email as to have it in writing can make a huge difference. Whether you prefer clear structure or autonomy to work and do things in your own way, genuinely different ways of working well. And knowing that what helps one person to do their best work can make another person's work harder. So I wonder how many of these things you've seen come up in your workplaces, and whether and how you've managed them, because you are the expert on your environment. But that problem solving and that awareness of difference is the part that I'm really wanting to emphasize. So, I think of a few examples from coaching situations that I've had, like people who have found that they work much better from home. They really struggle in the office environment where there are a lot of interruptions, and there's some some ability for them to be able to work from home, but being part of the team, being available to talk with people in person is also really important. So, being able to work through that and have an arrangement where there is a day a week or 2 days a week where they've agreed to come to the office, where they know why that's important, where they've committed to doing that, knowing that the days that they are going to do their best, most focused work is going to be their home days. That is not the equivalent when they're in the office, but that they are there for a reason. And for these people on their side of things, to be able to work things into those days that feel exciting and worthwhile for them, so they can feel positive about it, and rather than like they're being sort of made to do something, made a huge difference. So often is this negotiation between the team member and the leaders, and what's going to work for everyone and meet everybody's needs. So this is where, we don't want to put all of the responsibility onto the individual or all of the responsibility onto the leader. Leaders are not mind readers. We don't expect you to know what everyone on your team needs without them working that out for themselves and having those conversations. So the individuals who are on your teams, they need to do that work of understanding how they work best. That is where coaching can support that. This is where I work with people to explore that, to see what's worked well in past, to see what they want to try. But a leader can create the conditions that make it possible to act on that self-knowledge and to open up those conversations and make sure it's understood that this is kind of part of the collaboration. So this is kind of really getting to the end of the content part here. What can you do next as a leader to make your spaces places where everybody can do their best work, including those who don't fit sort of the best practice norms and assumptions about how people work best and what most people need. So the first thing I want to suggest is to review job descriptions and think about what it is that's truly essential for this role. We see this in job ads all the time, people listing things that would be nice to have, or often throwing in things like excellent team player, when what exactly does that mean? And do they just need to be able to work with people around them, even if they do their best work when they're sent away to do it independently? Sometimes even just being really clear on that in a job description, in a job ad, and thinking through that means you can get the people who are actually able to do the things that are most important best, without loading up other expectations on them that really aren't essential. Another thing is focusing on goals and outcomes, not the one right way to get there. This is where, opening up. This is one of the things that opens up a lot of flexibility without a lot of extra effort. And in the first session of this series, I shared a work experience of my own that I think is really relevant here. That one of the things that I find quite difficult is communicating over the phone, taking in information, making sure that I've conveyed everything that I need to, sort of focus around that. And I have my own ways of managing that and navigating that and making things work as best as they can for me. So if I'm making a phone call, it takes a lot of preparation about what I'm going to be talking about, usually making some notes beforehand. I need to go into my own space, and often I find having it on speakerphone a lot easier. And, all of that, it does take an extra load. So if it's important, then absolutely I'm willing to do that. But if there is a way that I can communicate things without needing to talk on the phone, I will do that instead. So definitely the pick up the phone and give them a quick phone call may be relevant if there's already lots of shared understanding there, but if there's a lot of context to give, not actually so easy. So I had a role once where I was asked to call around a whole lot of places, and I think it was around booking a venue and seeing what we could get for a good price. And there was a lot of information to convey. These weren't people who had any context about our organisation, or I wasn't sure how much they did. And I decided that the best way for me to go about that was to send them an email first with all of that information, and then follow up with a phone call afterwards. So I could say, you might have seen the email I sent, and the responses that I got were really positive. Most people said, oh, yes, I did see that email. And then they're ready to launch into the discussion with that context there already. Other people might have said, oh, no, I haven't had a chance to look at that yet, but I will. And then can I give you a call back? So great. But in that situation, because I had been asked to call these people, I had a manager come back to me and say, why didn't you call them? I asked you to call them. Why did a follow-up call come through? And, and explaining why I did that and mentioning that I do find, making phone call difficult. That felt like a big mistake because to them that was a red flag. And, this is an important part of the role. And if you're not confident doing that, then what's that going to look like? So again, having ways of doing things that work for us is really important. Being able to do them in those ways, to problem solve together, having that flexibility. Just because another person would do it this way doesn't mean it's the right way to do it. So the next part in our sort of what can you do next, I've said building flexibility into systems, not just individual exceptions. So this is where I think about the workplace environment and whether there is the ability for some people to choose to be in a consistent space and other people to be able to move around or whatever that might look like for you. Practicing clear and explicit communication. Being as clear as possible in the way that you communicate and as direct as possible generally makes things easier for everyone. Now, if we don't assume that there's a shared context, then we don't have people who are left misunderstanding. And, rather than assuming, model curiosity, help normalize conversations about difference. Often, the little comments that might be sort of critical of, even if it's not of an individual there, but of ways other people might do things, is the sort of thing that makes one person go, oh my goodness, there's no way that I can open up about that thing that I'm finding difficult, or sort of do that problem solving around what might work better because this doesn't feel safe. And encouraging conversations around strengths and needs. So these are conversations that as leaders, you can open up with people, whether that's as a team activity, if you have those sorts of teams who are able to sit down and discuss, reasonably personal things together that are relevant to the workplace, or one-on-one if you're having those kinds of one-on-one meetings with staff, and that can make a huge difference. So we've got a worksheet here that I've put together that I hope can support you in having those conversations and open up some ways of doing that. So I think Marissa's going to share that in the comments there, which I hope that you're able to see and access. But just in closing this, this isn't about having all the answers or about overhauling everything immediately, but it's about being curious, having honest conversations, and being willing to make some shifts, even small shifts, so that the people in your teams can do their best work and do it sustainably. So shall we have a time of questions if anybody has any kinds of questions or anything that you've seen in your workplaces that you'd just like to share?
Thank you, Lou. That was super informative and some really great tips to take away there. There's no questions in there yet, but I can kick us off with some. Um, does you mentioned earlier at the start about how sometimes people can get burnt out if they're, coping and stuff. Does burnout look different in neurodiverse people, or is it similar?
I mean, I think burnout can vary hugely, and maybe part of it is the that quite different things can be stresses. So the things that might stress somebody, yeah, if they've got different needs, might look different. So I know that often when people talk about burnout, they're talking about like the pressures from work becoming um, over a sustained period of time too much and
Mm.
and needing a break from that pressure and sometimes a break from the any work pressures. Whereas if life, sensory input, social interactions are all part of those pressures, then burnout might look like needing to step back from everything, needing to take all of that right back. So, autistic burnout is, particularly something that we see a huge amount. Um, in that the recovery of that can be a long time and might look like pulling right back on interactions with other people, spending a lot of time in environments that don't have minimal sensory input, not being able to engage with anything that we're interested in, let alone work. So yeah, I think that is that the kind of difference that you've seen come up.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. Thank you. Um, is there any language that people should be mindful of when discussing neurodiversity at work?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think, if somebody is disclosing a diagnosis, I would encourage you just to use the language that they use, because that might vary quite a lot. I really encourage what I would describe as neurodiversity affirming language, um, as sort of identity first language, particularly around autism. And I like to use that around ADHD as well. So, like, I describe myself as an autistic ADHDer as part of my identity. Rather than having conditions, because that's not how I see myself and understand myself. So I would usually say if you want to kind of encourage this idea that like, oh, different people just work differently, have different kinds of minds, then that's probably the best language to use to affirm that sort of perspective.
Great, thank you. If somebody in your team has kind of disclosed to you that they might be looking for a diagnosis or, going down that track to get some more answers, is there any way that a workplace can support that?
Oh, I don't know. That probably depends on your workplace. Uh,
Mm.
yeah, if you've because thinking about the barriers there, uh, no financial. So whatever that might look like. Um, Sometimes even just figuring out what the next steps are or where to go. So, sometimes that means kind of accessing somebody who can help with that kind of advice. And time. I mean, one, the time that it might take between booking an assessment and actually having that assessment. But on top of that, time off work to be able to go to those sorts of appointments. So all things to be mindful of that can make a big difference to people being able to access that. And knowing that if people have gone through that diagnostic assessment process for ADHD and then might be wanting to use ADHD medication as a support. Sometimes the process of trialing that and finding what might be helpful for them or what might work there can take a little bit of time. So just being mindful of that when people are going through things, it might make some difference to the way that they're able to show up.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think in patience, I think is probably a big word, hey?
Yeah.
Cool. Well, what are some, or maybe just one, what's an example of a common workplace norm that might unintentionally disadvantage neurodivergent people?
Really varies hugely. And as I think about people who I've worked with and my own experiences and things that I've heard, I can think of so many varied examples because it does vary so much. Um, yeah, again, depending on what kind of workplace you have, and knowing that some workplaces have a lot of people who have similar kinds of minds and ways of working, but they're all neurodivergent. So that becomes the workplace norm.
Mm.
Um, yeah. But things like, some people team building stuff and spending time with their colleagues is really important to them. It helps them feel connected, feel like they belong, really valued. But if that is what it takes to be part of the team, and some people find those interactions really, really difficult and stressful, then, is that them not being a good team player? Or is there a place for those people who don't love that, who don't connect well with that?
Yeah, very true.
Just examples of those differences that can come up.
Great, thank you. Someone has asked if you were looking at the job you're in and you can see the need for change is necessary, how might you suggest one consider a career change with the view of neurodiversity?
Oh, I think getting it clear on how you work best. Um, and then the kinds of industries, I guess, where that are best suited to that. I mean, it can be so tricky and it does depend on the environment.
Hmm.
Yeah. I think this is where things are so dependent, and that's probably my main point here, that it makes giving kind of clear answers for situations that can vary hugely really difficult. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I can imagine. Um, you mentioned like sort of, is there any like industries or maybe workplaces that might be more suited to people who are neurodiverse?
Again, depends
Depending.
depends on what I like. I mean, I we know that there are stereotypes in
Mm,
some industries, and often those correlate with some neurodivergent experiences.
mm,
But different people are different, right? So you might say that, say, like, I don't know, engineering might have a lot of people who are autistic. Um, and then, and I've found that in, uh, what do we call them? I think it like social justice type organizations and community work find a lot of people who are autistic and ADHDers and particularly have like a strong sense of how things should be, that they would connect to those neurodivergent identities that might look very different to an engineering firm.
mm.
So yeah.
Great. Thank you. Um, I think that might be the last of the. Oh, no, we've just had one more. Would you have any questions or advice on how to ask during a recruitment process how they would accommodate neurodiversity? I think I'm assuming this is coming from the individual perspective. You
Yeah.
sure? Hmm.
Yeah, and that's where it would be interesting to know how employers think that would be most helpful. Often people ask about whether they should disclose their diagnosis at that point in time, and I think that is an incredibly tricky question because, again, unless you know how much understanding the person who you're speaking to has around that particular neurodivergence. It might connect you to unhelpful sort of stereotypes that don't give, don't reflect how you show up and what you need and how you experience things. Or if they have good understanding, then hopefully it just highlights to them like, okay, there's going to be a bit of a spiky profile here. There's going to be some things that come up that you find difficult or that you need more support around alongside the things that you bring that you do really well. So that's where I would probably encourage to talk about particular needs that you have. And what you need from the organization. And if you don't get a sense that there is understanding or flexibility there, then that might be cause for concern for you. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Someone has said, not a question, but a comment. There are so many jobs where being neurodivergent is a competitive advantage. We're good at a job because of our neurodivergence, not in spite of it. It would be amazing if organisations could recognise this so that accommodations aren't viewed as a burden or doing something extra.
Yeah, absolutely. I so agree. And I hope that that's what I've conveyed here as well. Yeah, that you don't get the best of us unless you're willing to understand what we need to be able to give that. Yeah.
So true. Thank you. Cool. Does anybody have any more questions? I have one more. So, what would you recommend someone do if they have maybe communicated that their needs, like for example, they want to use headphones in the open plan office to, help distractions, but the managers have said this is not okay. How do you sort of navigate those conversations? Like what do you do next from there?
Oh, so tricky. Yeah. It is difficult because I think, in coaching, we often look at what is within your control and what's not. And the things that aren't within your control, there are ways that we might try and influence that, ways that we might try and bring up those conversations. But when it comes down to it, if there's somebody else who has control over what you're allowed to do and what you're not, then it's a very, very difficult situation. So, I mean, this is where I kind of hope framing it as this will make a big difference to how well I'm able to work. Will show that they are getting something from this, that there is an advantage to the workplace to allow you to work in the way that suits best. Yeah. And then, if there is a good reason that why that isn't going to work, then that can be kind of part of that problem solving discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Cool. Well, I don't think there is any other questions. Would you like to maybe chat about the next webinar of what we've got coming up?
Yeah, I've still got that up on the screen, don't I? Yes. Yep. So this was session 2. Our third session is around ways of supporting people who are neurodivergent. So sort of aimed at people who are in support roles, but perhaps that is somebody in your family. Perhaps you are wanting to kind of explore that just for yourself and your own experiences. But that one will be focusing much more particularly on autistic and ADHD experiences, and things that we need to be able to do well, a bit more specifically. So that one's on the 2nd of April. I hope that you can be there.
All right. Thanks, Lou. Cool. Should we close us off with a karakia?
Yes, great. I'll give you that slide. Oh, no, that's just me. If you want to book a session with me through the Ignite platform, and I think Marissa's put some links there as well that you can go straight to, or flick me an email if there's anything else you kind of want to contact me around. And here's our karakia.
Great. Thanks, Lou. Mati rongo ka mohio, mati mohio ka marama, mati marama ka mātou, mati mātou ka ora. Through listening comes awareness, through awareness comes understanding, through understanding comes knowledge, through knowledge comes life and well-being. Kia ora.